this because we didn't. Now we are recording. So with that, I will hand it over to Sandy, and we will have lost for posterity the introduction.
And that was the best part. Great. Well, thank you so much. I am truly honored to be invited to do this. So thank you for having me. Today, I want to talk about something that I've been thinking about for the last few years, which is wealth. The research on wealth and what we know about wealth has made just a ton of progress in the last, I would say, 15 years, 15 to 20 years, in part because we've just been getting much better and better data. So wealth data has not been something that's easy to come by. And so recently, we've really been able to take big steps forward as more and more data become available and people become more and more industrious in terms of finding that data. So just to give you a little overview, this is probably stuff that you're already familiar with, but if you look at wealth inequality in the United States, so this is the share of wealth held by the top 10% in the US, what we see is that there was huge inequality that declined a lot down to the late 1970s, early 80s. And then you see this reversal, and recently in the last 3 decades, we've seen this big rise in inequality. And this is some of the data from Saez and Zuckman, their 2020 paper. They've kind of done incredibly innovative work putting together this series. We see this if we look at other metrics. So if you look at the top 1%, the share of wealth held by the top 1%, or even the top 0.1%, you see the same pattern. So it's really that the wealthy are just becoming incredibly wealthy over this time period. And so that, I think, is somewhat concerning. What's going on? Why is there so much concentration of wealth? When we look at differences by race, it's another troubling pattern. Just to give you a statistic, the net worth of a typical white family was nearly 10 times that of a Black family in 2016. This is from a Hamilton Project report by McIntosh, Moss, Nunn, and Shamba. And what this is showing is by income percentile. So we're grouped by income percentile. So comparing individuals with the same income on average, what you see is that whites have a lot more wealth conditional on income than Blacks do. And that's true all throughout the distribution, except the very bottom, it's still true, but the amount of wealth is very, very small for both groups. So this is also very troubling. There's really interesting new work. I don't even know that it's a paper yet that's trying to document not just what's going on right now in terms of wealth inequality by race, but the historical pattern. So this is from really brand new research by Alora Derenoncourt, Kim Kuhn, and Shalarik, where what they're doing is trying to put together a series starting in 1860 of the white-black wealth ratio. And so what you can see is that there was a lot of convergence post 1860, as you might expect, but it's really flattened out at a pretty high level, right? So we're at about 6 to 1. And what's also interesting, not just that it's flattened out at this high level, but that it's actually been pretty flat for a long time. And so I think that's kind of interesting, despite the fact that we've seen, a lot of progress on a number of dimensions. Really, we haven't seen progress on this dimension. We can also look internationally. So if you look at other countries, so this is from the World Inequality Database based on national accounts, what we see is that other countries have faced similar patterns. So here I've added Great Britain and France to the US time series. And you can see starting in 1920, there was a lot of inequality in Great Britain and France, experienced the same decline, but then also started going up again, albeit at a lower level than in the United States. So this is something that's happening not just in the US, but happening in other countries as well. So all of this might be less troubling if there was a lot of mobility across generations. So if it were the case that every kid when they were born had equal opportunity and equal probability of being at the top, we might not worry quite as much about the inequality. I think we'd still worry about the cross-sectional inequality, but probably not quite as much. However, what we know is that there is a lot of persistence in wealth across generations. And so this has been documented. Earlier work by Charles and Hurst used the PSID and find intergenerational wealth elasticities of about 0.37 for net wealth in the United States. And so, and other countries have documented also very high persistence in wealth across generations. And so this, cross-sectional inequality combined with this intergenerational persistence, I think, is very troubling. So what I want to talk about in today is the research on kind of what's driving this persistence across generations. So I'm focusing on the intergenerational aspect of it. And so I'm going to first talk about what we know about nature versus nurture. So how much of it is kind of genetics, that parents with wealth have kids who would become wealthy no matter what because they're higher ability or born with these attributes that make them more likely to accumulate wealth, and how much of it is really just the opportunity and environment that the parent provides. And then I'll talk about, so that's one part. I'll talk about kind of other work that's really trying to get at the underlying causal mechanism. So if we have a shock to wealth, how does that affect children's outcomes? And I don't think there's some historical data and studies that can look at shocks to parents' wealth and children's wealth. More recent work, it's hard to find kind of that long a panel for wealth across generations. So it looks at a wealth shock and children's other outcomes. And so I want to kind of give an overview of where we are in the literature. I think, as I mentioned, we've made a lot of progress in the last 15 years. You'll see a lot of these papers that I'm citing are really recent. And the message I think that we get from this is not clear. And so I think it just highlights how much room there is for more work going forward. And then at the end of the talk, I want to talk about something that I've been thinking about recently, which is this idea of what do we mean by wealth? So I want to kind of take a step back and think big picture. What do we mean when we talk about someone's wealth? So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is why is wealth correlated across generations? So try to get at what is the role of nature versus nurture in the intergenerational transmission of wealth. And it relates to this famous conversation that never happened where F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the rich are different than you and me. And Hemingway said, yes, they have more money. And I think this kind of encapsulates the idea of what we're trying to distinguish. Fitzgerald thought that they are inherently different types of people, right? They're like better people. And so it's not surprising that when they're born, they're going to do better no matter what, because they're different. And Hemingway's saying, well, no, they just have more money. And anyone who had that much money growing up would do that well as well. And so that's what we're trying to get at. You can think of a number of different reasons why nature and nurture would affect intergenerational transmission of wealth. So for pre-birth factors, what we think of as nature is if you think there's genetic components to skills, genetic components to attitudes and preferences, so risk aversion and time preferences. To the extent these things are kind of you're born with them, that would be these pre-birth nature factors. And in terms of environment, there's lots of reasons, that parents can influence their children's wealth. So wealthier parents could invest more in their children, give them classes, invest more in their education, which will lead them to accumulate more wealth. They could help them with their career. So, I network and get them good jobs. I could teach my kids about risk, about savings, about asset portfolios, how to save, or they even just could observe me. I don't even have to teach them. I could just literally give financial resources like loaning my children money, or at the extreme, literally give them wealth. And so that will be part of the intergenerational transmission of wealth. And so in general, obviously, it's difficult to distinguish the effect of these pre-birth factors from post-birth factors, because the same parents are the ones that are giving both the genes and the environment. So what I do and work with Paul Devereaux, Petter Lundberg, and Kaveh Majlesi is use administrative data on Sweden and look at adoptees. And so the nice feature of adoption in Sweden at this time period between children born between 1950 and 1970 was that the state kept track of both biological and adoptive parents. And so we can observe both those biological and adoptive parents to distinguish the role of nature versus nurture in the transmission of wealth. And then what we do after we do that is try to provide suggestive evidence on the mechanisms through which that post-birth environment will affect children's wealth. And that part is much more speculative. Okay, just to give you an idea of what we're doing. So it's a really straightforward exercise. If you can just envision, what we're doing is we're relating the wealth of the child to that of the wealth of the biological parents and the adoptive parents, and saying, okay, which one matters more? And to be clear, we are not at all the first one to use this specification or this identification strategy. There's a big literature, I've done other work on this, but Bjorklund, Lindahl, and Plug, I think, have kind of the seminal paper doing this. And I remember when I saw them in the early 2000s presented and thinking, oh my gosh, this is amazing that you can do this. I'll talk a little bit about the context in 1 minute, but just to give you an idea of how we're doing it, we're relating the wealth of the child to those of the biological and the adoptive parents. We're going to use rank specification, so the rank of the child in net wealth relative to the rank of the biological and adoptive parents, but our conclusions hold no matter what specification we use. So the rank specification is nice because it's linear and it works well, but in the paper you can see it's not just because of the functional form. We also just include a very parsimonious set of controls where it's year of birth of parents and children and the gender of the child. And the way that we calculate these ranks is your within cohort rank. So basically we compare your rank to those of others, your wealth to those of others at the same age. So it's where you are within your age group. And for parents, because they might be different ages, we use their average cohort. Okay, to give you an idea of the data, because that's really kind of the star of this in terms of what we can do, it's using the Swedish Wealth Register. So this is where I said, the wealth research has really moved ahead a lot, in part because recently there's been a lot more data available, and the Scandinavian countries, importantly, had a wealth tax. So Norway still has a wealth tax. Here we're using Sweden. So we have wealth data from 1999 to 2006. And so here it's just really high quality data on your wealth because you were taxed on it. So the state was very interested in making sure it was reported, and it's reported by the financial institutions themselves. It's not self-reported. So the quality of the data is quite high. And basically we observe anything that you own, housing, stocks, bonds, savings accounts held outside of retirement accounts. So we don't have pensions, although in some of our specifications, we impute your pension from some data that we have, and you'll see the conclusions don't change. And to this wealth registry, we can match the population registry. And so then we can observe all the relationships in the family. So we can see parents and children. And so in our sample, what we use is all Swedish citizens who were born in Sweden between 1950 and 1970, with all applicable parents alive in 1999. So that means you had to have both your biological and your adoptive parents for the adoption sample alive in 1999, because otherwise we can't observe your wealth. That's our first year of wealth. And with at least one adoptive parent alive in 2006. And we're doing that because we want to avoid inheritances. And I'll show you, we do some checks for adding in inheritances. But for now, we're just thinking about this intergenerational transmission absent inheritances. And so we measure the wealth of the parents in 1999 and the wealth of the children in 2006. So here's what we get when we look at the whole sample of kids born between 1950 and 1970. So this is not limited to adoptees, but it's for whom we have wealth information of parents in 1999. So same sample restrictions. And what you can see is this is the within cohort rank of parents plotted against that of the children. And so on the left, we did not trim the data. And so what we see is it's relatively linear through most, and clearly a positive correlation. It spikes up at the top. This has been shown in other work that there is at the very top, there's a very high correlation between parents and children. And what's interesting is this bottom little bit, and it's this downward shape because for parents with very, very low rank, they actually have very negative net wealth. And you can't get that poor without actually being kind of a wealthy type person because you owe so much money. And so those kids actually do a bit better because they're actually like the kids of wealthy type people who just were very unsuccessful wealthy people. When we trim the data, so we present all our results untrimmed, and here's trimming the top and bottom 5%, you can see this rank regression looks quite linear. Here's when we look at the adoptive children. And so on the left is the rank relationship for biological parents and adoptive children. And then on the right is the adoptive parents and adopted children. And so what's interesting, there's a number of things here that I think are interesting. One, this is the confidence interval. So there was a confidence interval on those other graphs, but we had over 1 million kids, so you can't actually see it to the naked eye. Here with the adoptees, we have a much smaller sample of about 2,500, I think. So we have some confidence intervals. What's interesting is that biological parents are disproportionately at the bottom of the wealth distribution. And this is the ranking in the whole distribution, not in just the distribution of adopted parents. Or biological parents, it's in the whole distribution. So most of our data, if you look at biological parents, are kind of lower down. And so we have very few biological parents way at the top of the distribution. In contrast, adoptive parents actually look better than average. So we have more of our data at the top here and much less at the bottom. And so when we trim the data, so here's when we trim, oh, here was untrimmed, I skipped. Here's when we trim the data. And in theory, you could look at this and have the answer. So how does the slope of the biological parents regression look compared to the adoptive parents? I'm not a visual person, so to me, I cannot tell, but some people would look at this and say, oh, well, this one, the biological parents is flatter, and you would be correct, because when we run the regression, what you see, I present the full sample and then the trimmed where we're trimming the top and bottom 5%. And we present everything for the biological children. So that's kind of most kids where you're raised by your biological parent, 1.2 million. And here is the adoptee sample. And this is just the coefficient on the rank of your biological parents' net wealth and the rank on your adoptive parents' net wealth. So this is the rank correlation in wealth in Sweden, 0.34, 0.33, depending on trimming or not. And when you look at the adoptees, what we see is that adoption, the biological parent is much less important than the adoptive parent. And then when we trim, because we're getting rid of those two parts, it's a little bit, they're a little bit closer together, but still the biological parent coefficient is much, much smaller, suggesting a much stronger role for adoptive parents' net wealth. Okay. Okay, when we allow for inheritance, we get this really interesting finding. So I said that so far we've constrained our sample so that you had to have at least one of your parents, the adoptive parents, alive in 2006 when we measure your wealth to avoid kind of getting inheritances in there. So, but what we did as a specification check is say, well, let's let those people back in. So it's a little bit of a weird sample. So I want to be clear, because you still have to have had both your parents alive in 1999, because we still need to get their wealth information, and we didn't have wealth information prior to 1999. But now we're adding in about the 100 adoptive kids whose adoptive parents both died between 1999 and 2006. And so we're going to add a dummy variable for that and then interact that with the rank of the adoptive parent's wealth. What we see is these two coefficients are almost identical to the previous ones that I showed you. So not surprisingly, these 100 observations haven't changed very much. With adoptive parents' wealth, our opportunity being much more important than this nature idea. What's interesting is that when you allow for inheritances, the effect of adoptive parental wealth more than doubles, okay? Because you should think of that, this is the sum of the two is now for when you allow for inheritance, this effect gets much, much bigger. And then as a kind of a further check, we say, well, let's make sure that you definitely don't have an inheritance. So we're gonna make sure that both of your parents are alive. And again, that doesn't change anything. So it seems like, you know, adoptive parents are really important, suggesting opportunity is important, and inheritance makes that even bigger. So that's even in the absence of inheritance. In terms of mechanisms, there are a number of possible mechanisms, and we're not able to do anything kind of super convincing in terms of what's going on there. But we did try to think about suggestive, you know, evidence of what might be going on. So we know parental wealth is highly correlated with other parents' characteristics like education or income, and the correlation is about 0.25 in our sample between wealth and education and wealth and income. I think one is 0.23 and one is 0.28. And you can imagine higher parental education could be the causal force that's increasing investment in children, leading to them to having higher wealth. It may be that parents with higher wealth also have higher earnings and they're able to help their children in the labor market. So it may not be wealth that matters, but these other correlates about parents. It could be that parents' wealth has direct effects on children's education or career. So I have more money, a bigger pot of money, so I can invest more in your education or your career. Or it could be that parental wealth is affecting how my kids save, how they invest their assets, what decisions in terms of asset investment they make. And so that's another possible channel. When we look at this, all we're doing here is we look at how parents' wealth, you know, adoptive and biological, affects these outcomes, and then doing one of these, you know, kind of bad regressions where we just include these variables and see how much they soak up. What was interesting to us is that parents' education and income actually explains very little of the link between adoptive parents' wealth and children's wealth. And that's surprising to us just because we know they're so highly correlated, but the coefficient on wealth, adoptive parents' wealth, is virtually unchanged, suggesting that it really might be working through wealth. When we include controls for our children's income and education, the coefficient goes down by about 10%. And then differential investment behavior can also explain, you know, about 10 to 12% of what's going on in terms of how you've allocated your portfolio. One thing that was interesting is that saving actually works in the wrong way, in that if you have wealthy parents, you save less, which of course makes sense if you think about saving as kind of or an insurance policy. If my parents are rich and I have them as my insurance policy, I don't need my own savings. And so overall, we can't really explain more than about 25% of what's going on with these controls, suggesting that, there's other things going on. At the end of this project, we did kind of this interesting comparison because, as I said, there have been a number of papers using adoptees to look at nature versus nurture in different outcomes. And so we wanted to see if we used a common data set and how wealth compared. And so this graph basically plots the coefficient on the biological parents' rank against the adoptive parents' rank and coefficient. And so this 45-degree line is what tells you where they're equal. So where nature and nurture are equally important. And so you can see in schooling, and this is consistent with what Bjorklund, Lindahl and Flug found before, is more biology than nurture. So it's more nature going on there. Income and earnings are closer, a little more environment than nature, but pretty close to the line. When you start looking at wealth and wealth behavior, you see that becomes much more opportunity or nurture. And so here's our wealth rank, which is pretty far from the line. And then once you add in inheritances, you see that that's really being dominated by environment or opportunity. Okay, so I think that was a really interesting exercise in that we know now that opportunity plays a big role with wealth transmission. And so the next obvious step is to try to understand what it is about the opportunity that is affecting children's wealth. And so here, I want to just highlight a few papers that I thought were particularly kind of cool and interesting. I am not trying to give an exhaustive review of the literature. There are a number of, I think, very exciting papers on this topic, but these were a few that kind of caught my eye and like, wow, this is really cool. So I kind of broke them into three categories. One is, and this has been, I think, to me, the most exciting is what we've seen in recent work from economic historians, learning about how shocks to parents' wealth affect kids' wealth using these kind of, amazing natural experiments from history. There's also a recent literature using housing wealth as a shock to overall wealth. So if you see housing prices, you're in a neighborhood where prices are going up, that's a positive shock to people who own homes. And how does that affect their kids' outcomes? And then there's been a number of really nice papers looking at lottery wins as an exogenous shock to wealth. The first paper I just want to mention, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of papers, but I just thought they were so cool. There's a paper by Blakely and Ferry that people might already know about, but it basically says, okay, there was an experience where following the eviction of the Cherokee from Northwest Georgia, the state basically had a lottery for the land. And basically almost all white males aged 18 and older in the state were registered, and this happened in 1832. And it was really kind of this random gift of land. So the value of the land was substantial. It was about equivalent to about 5 years' work for an unskilled laborer. And it was a pure wealth shock. So you didn't have to commit to homesteading or living on it or doing anything. You got a claim that you could turn around right then and sell. And so it was literally a lottery of cash, essentially. And so what they do is they took that and followed the winners and then created control groups to see, okay, how did the kids of these lottery winners do compared to the lottery losers? And it's an amazing effort in data collection. And what they find is that there's no effect of a lottery win on sons' wealth. There's no effect on their occupational standing or literacy 30 or more years later. So it doesn't seem to be having this positive causal effect. And then they find no effect even on the next generation in terms of grandchildren's literacy or school attendance. And this is despite the fact that there are these intergenerational correlations. So it's not that in that time period, there wasn't this intergenerational persistence. There are these underlying correlations. And so they conclude that the correlations just must reflect kind of deeper underlying characteristics that persist through family lines. Another paper that I think is particularly compelling is a paper by Auger, Bustan, and Erickson, where they're looking at the intergenerational effects of this large wealth shock with the abolition of slavery. And so they say that, formal abolition of slavery was a shock to the wealth of white Southern slave owners, like they just lost all that wealth. And so the way they do it is that they take households that held more wealth in the form of slaves in 1860, and those were the treated households, because those are the ones, if you had a lot of slaves, you're the one who's going to experience the more negative wealth shock by 1870 compared to those who were equally wealthy but had fewer slaves, and so less wealth in forms of slaves. And what they see, consistent actually with the Blakely and Ferry paper, is that again, the shock was not transmitted to the next generation. So by 1900, sons who grew up in slaveholding households, and those were the ones who had the biggest negative shock, had actually caught up to or even surpassed the economic status of sons from comparable households who didn't experience the negative shock. And then by 1940, the grandchildren of slaveholders were more likely to have graduated from high school or college and to hold white collar positions. So again, the opposite of what we might expect if this were causal. And so they conclude that the evidence suggests that this was driven by marriage and social networks. So this kind of collection suggests that maybe there isn't this causal effect, at least in this context. Another paper that I'm not going to talk about in detail, but I really enjoyed reading, was by Melinda Miller, published in Restat, where it's looking at the racial wealth gap in the Cherokee Nation, which after the abolition of slavery was required to give their former slaves land in the Cherokee Nation, and Miller compares how the racial wage gap, or the racial wealth gap, the racial wealth gap in the Cherokee Nation, where the former slaves got the land, how they do relative to in the South, where the former slaves did not get the land, and she sees that there's actually much more convergence there. So in some circumstances, clearly this wealth shock matters. So that seems very important to think about. There's other work that looks at the causal effect of wealth by looking at housing wealth. So just to give one example, there are a number of papers that do this, is Mike Lovenheim's paper in Jolly, where you treat housing appreciation as a shock to wealth. And he uses short-run changes in home prices as a shock to wealth in the 4 years before a child is of college age. And he's looking at the likelihood of going to college. And he actually finds sizable effects. So it's hard if you look at it, a 10,000 increase in home equity increases the likelihood that a child goes to college by 0.7 percentage points. So it seems very small, but if you actually look at the average home equity, which rose by about $57,000 between 2001 and 2005, this was actually, a really large increase in college attendance. And he also finds that the effects are strongest for lower income households. And just to kind of build on this, he has some new work, a project that he started that I'm excited to see with co-authors, where he's kind of doing something like this in Denmark. So we can kind of, with their better data, get more at what the mechanisms might be. And then the last type of paper that I think has been really exciting are these lottery papers. So Cesarini, Lindquist, Ostling, and Wallace have a really nice paper where there was a Swedish lottery. And basically you treat lottery wins as a shock to wealth, and then you compare kind of big winners to small winners. And the reason that's important is we generally don't have, not everyone is playing the lottery, although in Sweden it seems quite common. And so you might worry that there's selection in who's doing it. So by comparing big winners to small winners, you're kind of getting rid of, at least, or trying to control for selection. And what they find is basically, to be fair, their paper is mostly about health and parents' health outcomes as well as the children's outcomes. But in terms of the intergenerational transmission, they basically find zero effect in terms of children's GPA test scores and non-cognitive skills. So really no effect for wealth. And you might think that that's Sweden specific because maybe you don't need to save so much money for college or something, although, there's still a lot of things that money can buy even in Sweden. In really recent work, it just came out this year in the AER, Bowman, Fairley, Goodman, and Eisen use US tax data on lottery wins and look at lottery wins in the US, whether you get the win before your kid graduates from high school versus after your kid graduates from high school. And then they compare, big winners and small winners, and say, well, if you get it early, then if there's credit constraints, then that should smooth that out. And so your kid should be more likely to go to college. And using this data, they find basically no effect for wins that would be sufficient to cover the cost of college and for households that are most likely to face constraints. So it seems like, again, it's not mattering. But the results are consistent with the notion that consuming college is a normal good. So I had to put this because it's so shocking to me. This is how big the lottery win is. That's what's on the left-hand side. And the y-axis, the x-axis is the college attendance rate. And so, and the black bar is if you got the money before your child had graduated high school, and the white bar is if you got the money after. So we expect kind of the after to be the control. And what you see is for these relatively small, and when I say small, $100,000, so it's not small. These, if you were really credit constrained, you might think that these would be sufficient to kind of make you uncredit constrained. So we might expect to see, similar size effects here. In fact, we don't, they're almost even. And it's only when you start getting these really big awards does that change behavior. And so they said, well, this is just consistent with education being a normal good. So I thought that was really surprising. Overall, I think in terms of causation, I hope it's clear that it's really a mixed bag, that we don't really know what's going on. And, depending on how we estimate and under what circumstances, we find very different findings. And I think, does that mean we don't know anything? No, I think it means we know a lot. But it's just going to be, going forward, we need to tease out, is this context specific? Is it time specific? What's going on? So I think all of these papers are super inspiring to me in terms of what we can do in the future, but it also highlights how much work we have left to do. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is basically an aside that I thought about talking about at first, but it kind of undermines everything else I said. So I didn't want to start with that. So I'm just going to end with it. And that is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And so when we talk about wealth, it's actually a really messy measure. And so if you start to do research on wealth, you'll see this very quickly, that wealth is kind of this weird thing where it's not just a result of your income, but also your spending. So it's the result of both actions to increase the flow of money to a household, such as, work behavior and things like that, like similar to income, but also a function of how you've consumed. And so as a result, individuals with the same income could have very different wealth because of differing consumption or spending patterns, or similarly, individuals could have very similar wealth, but very different sources of wealth. And so if you think about inequality, it seems really important to kind of take a step back and think about where the wealth is coming from and how much of the wealth differences we observe are due to consumption differences. And so to kind of make this more concrete, you can imagine two households where one household has very little labor income, but a large inheritance from their parents. So they just got a lot of money, they invest it, they live off that, and they're wealthy in the end. Versus another household that doesn't get any inheritance, but works really hard and saves their labor income, but ends up with the same amount of wealth at the end of at age 65. Let's say they're both 65. So here we have two people who would have the same wealth. Would we want to say that was an equal society given how they got there? Similarly, if you had two households where they had the exact same income sources, but one spent a lot and one saved a lot. And so at age 65 here, they had huge inequality in their wealth, but actually had the same flow of income and just made different decisions. Would we want to conclude that that was a really unequal society? And so once you start thinking about this, wealth gets very messy. And so this is what I've been thinking about with recent work by Paul Devereaux, Fanny Landau, and Chell Salvanis. So Paul and Chell and I have obviously been working on this for a long time, and Fanny is a great postdoc at NHH. She got her PhD at the Paris School of Economics, and she's great. So I want everyone to be on the lookout for Fanny. And what we've been doing together is trying to think about this. And so what we've done, and this is very much work in progress, so I'm very open to thoughts people have in terms of what to do with this. We create this measure of potential wealth or income inflows in the absence of consumption, and then we compare that to the net wealth, which is what we observe in most data sets, and say, well, if we get rid of consumption, how close does net wealth look to potential wealth? And in the absence of consumption, and importantly, how is the rank correlation similar? And then we can also take this measure of income inflows or potential wealth and say, well, where are people in the distribution getting their money from? Where is the wealth coming from, and does it vary across distribution? And so that's what this project is doing. To do that, what we use is a comprehensive data set from Norway. The reason we use Norway is because to do this, as I said, we're going to create a measure of what we call potential wealth, which is basically the sum of all the income inflows that you receive, ideally over your lifetime. But of course, we don't have data over people's lifetime, so we use the 20 years we have in Norway. But it is very data intensive in that we need to have a long period of time to actually see how this evolves over your lifetime. And so we create these two measures. One is this potential wealth or income inflows, which is just literally the adding up from 1994 to 2013. And then we have this deep potential wealth, very badly named, which is just basically getting at the most basic sources of income. And so we're considering just labor income, government transfers, and inheritance and gifts. And then we're going to grow that up to 2013. So money, basically we give you a return on that. So money that you get in 1995 is worth more than money that you get in 2013, for example. And then in this project, we just look at the correlation between the net wealth that we observe in data, and that we usually is all we have in most data sets, and say, well, how correlated is this with this new measure of potential wealth? Is net wealth a good proxy? And then we look at more at the sources of wealth and how it varies across the distribution. Since I need to finish, we contribute to, there's obviously a large literature looking at wealth, and our contribution is really just taking a big picture perspective and saying, so it's really just an adding up constraint. So in the paper, and I know I have very little time, Kevin, so I will be brief. In the paper, we spend a lot of time talking about the fact that we're using data from Norway, and how similar is Norway to other countries in terms of, what we can learn from Norway. And so what we do is compare survey data to the Norwegian data to compare other countries. And we see that, for example, the household's net wealth distribution in Norway is very similar to that in other countries in Europe. And then we look at other statistics and see, on a lot of dimensions, particularly in terms of wealth inequality, Norway looks a lot like other countries. And that may be surprising to you if you think, everyone is either super wealthy in Norway or there's just no variation, because what we see is that it's very similar. If you look at national accounts, the net wealth is a little bit lower in Norway than in other countries. But we still think Norway is informative. And importantly, Norway has a wealth tax, which is why we have all this data. And so we create these two measures of potential wealth and deep potential wealth, where we're just literally adding up the components over the time period. So your potential wealth is your net wealth in 1994, plus the inflow of all the income that you're getting between 1995 and 2013. So adding in your net earnings, your capital income, which is from interests and dividends, net government transfers, inheritance and gifts, lottery wins, the appreciation of real assets, which is housing wealth and some business wealth, the appreciation of financial assets, so stocks, held in the stock market and unlisted stocks, and then subtracting off the wealth tax. We define this deep potential wealth as just those main components, which are labor income, government transfers, and inheritance, and then we're going to give you a return on that each year. So we're going to grow that up based on your income, your net wealth decile in the return in that year. So the data are very good. I'm going to just say that. I don't know why my timing is so off when I did practice. But I do want to say one thing. For most of the analysis, we're focusing on people aged 26 to 46 who aged to be 45 to 65, but we can actually do it for any 20-year age group. So we do it up to age 85. And we define individual household wealth as the average wealth within the couple for non-single individuals. So if you are single, you get the wealth, the income that you brought in that household. If you are part of a couple, we take the household wealth and the household income and divide it by 2. Okay, and here's what the distributions look like. So here's net wealth, which is what we normally observe in the data. Here's our potential wealth, and this is the deep potential wealth. And so not surprisingly, the potential wealth and deep potential wealth are shifted to the right because we're not letting people live and consume. So these are the potential for consumption for their budget constraint, essentially. And so you can think about, how do these two measures compare? We can look at the correlations, which are about 0.78 between potential wealth and net wealth. But this is really sensitive to the very top. When we look at rank correlations, what we see is that for the middle of the distribution, it's much flatter. At the top and the bottom, the correlations are stronger. And so at the very top of the distribution, for very rich people, potential wealth and net wealth are actually very, very highly correlated. For most people in the middle, it's much less so. So net wealth is less informative about their potential wealth. When we look at where wealth is coming from, this is across the potential wealth distribution, we see that most of it is coming, so this adds to 1. So this is the share of potential wealth coming from each source. And so most of it is this purple. which is labor income. So most people are getting most of their wealth, their potential wealth, from labor income. We've broken the top decile to 90 to 99 and 99 to 100. Government transfers, this green, become less important across the distribution. Housing wealth is, very important in the middle of the distribution. This is risky assets, so kind of stocks and risky assets are only important at the very top. And what's interesting, and we spend a lot of time in the paper focusing on this little green bar, which is actually inheritance. And no matter what we do, inheritance never becomes important at any point in the distribution. And so when we look at deep potential wealth, we see something very similar. So this is government transfers. This is labor income. Obviously, labor income becomes more important when we're growing it up instead of letting people invest it and transfer it into something else. But even in this specification or this metric, inheritance is still not important. So to conclude, I'm sorry I had to rush through it at the end, but it's, I think, really interesting to think about what we mean when we measure wealth. It kind of came up to me when we started working on a project that we're going back to, where we were looking at how parents' wealth affects kids and how the timing might matter. And you kind of realize that if you look at people who have kids who are like 10 years old and they have the same income, but one has more wealth, well, it could be, that's good for the kid because there's more resources in the household, or it could be that it's actually bad for the kid because it means the parents didn't spend money on the kids 5 years ago. And so wealth is actually a really messy measure. And so I think I want to kind of conclude with saying, we've made a lot of progress in terms of understanding wealth inequality. There's great new data. And thanks to all the people who have contributed to that. I think there have been really innovative studies of causal mechanisms. I think one thing that I hope we do more going forward is kind of think more about what we mean by wealth when we talk about wealth inequality. And with that, I will stop. Sorry,
Kevin. That was terrific. We have time for maybe, if we're lucky, maybe 2 questions. Paul Ayer has one in the chat, but what I'm going to do, Paul, is allow you to talk, and you can either ask that question or a different one, and people can raise their hands, and I might fit in a couple of people.
Wow, what an honor. Can you hear me?
I know, Paul, there's a lot of pressure on you. Yeah.
I had a question from your very first slides. You showed these really interesting growing inequality within countries. What if you did the whole world on one chart? My guess is inequality has actually reduced in the world in the last 50 years, but I don't know that I've ever seen anybody show that. Am I missing it?
I feel like someone has shown it. I feel like Dina Pomerantz may have tweeted it at some point, but I can't. I think it's getting better, but I can't remember. So I apologize, but it's a good question.
Vincent Cobb.
Yes, I was also the person who made the statement in the chat there, talking about how enjoyable the discussion was thus far in terms of the questions it poses, as well as answers. But one of the things I was looking at initially when you were looking at the how much more important it seemed that the adoptive parents had in terms of wealth than the biological parents, I'm just wondering if that might have been based on selection error, because maybe the adoptive parents were wealthier or more educated, and they transferred some characteristics to them that impacted their potential for wealth other than the biological parents.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We actually did in the paper, we looked at the subset of adoptive parents who actually had their own biological kids, and just to see, and what we see is their correlation is the same as the population as a whole. So at least in terms of the intergenerational correlation between the adoptive parents and their own biological kids, they look like the population as a whole.
Okay,
So I
that's
agree.
curious.
Yeah,
Because
I
what
agree.
I
It's
know
really
I'm adopted
interesting.
myself, and I grew up
Uh,
in a household where so it was very, very interesting to see the differences in educational attainment between the natural children and the adoptive parents and the adoptive children, and it was very curious to see the results.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. And Nicole Fortin pointed out that to answer Paul's question, go to World in Data on the website. Yeah.
And with that, we're going to have to thank Sandy. I don't have the wonderful applause that
I know. What's up,
Moffat
Kevin?
had. I do once again want to remind you all that the cocktail party is at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 1800 hours, if that's the way you think about time, in the gather room, which is a fun place to be. And it'll be great if there are a lot of us there to meet with each other, and you'll see. It's just a fun place. It's like being at a cocktail party. So Sandy, thank you again so much. This was
Thanks,
wonderful.
Kevin.
And hope to see you in the cocktail party.
Yes, thank you. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.